Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Titiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Ditiyampi Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Ditiyampi Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. So I hope that everybody's keeping well wherever may be. And I've come down here to Ovāda, to a forest monastery here, and actually we're in the middle of the river right now. This was one of the last places that Dhamma-Vinaya Bhante came, in Tena, I think. And he has a kuti not far from here, that he established not far from here in the forest. So one of the final photos, or not one of the final ones, but the photo that was displayed at his funeral was actually taken here. So as with most of the areas Dhamma-Vinaya Bhante stayed, it's a very inspiring, very isolated area. So when practicing meditation, one needs to use all of the resources one has at its disposal. I remember reading about the history of China a long time ago, and they basically had this period where warfare was very stately. Like one person would be going through in a chariot and firing an arrow, and then another person would be firing. And if he didn't give the first man who fired a chance to fire back, it would be considered rude, perhaps. There's this kind of story in the Chinese annals, I guess you'd call it, about that. And later on, as things got more and more competitive, then the warfare became total. It became all out. In other words, almost anything went. There were no rules of engagement necessarily, no rules of war. It was basically just you win. Win at all costs. So when we come to practice meditation, one of the good things to imagine is that we're actually in a fight. There's many different metaphors one can use for training the mind, but one of them is a fight. It's a fight against what we might call our defilements or our kilesas. So in the Thai forest tradition, the great teachers, they almost always talk about these defilements as if they're living things. They're not just habits that a person has accumulated. It talks about them almost as if they're a living enemy and one that has access to one's thoughts. So at the outset of a person's meditation training, things can be very, very formal. It's kind of, one learns a very specific technique and how to do it, and this is effective for clearing out some of the less savvy, less crafty defilements in a person's mind. So I remember when I was a young man, I first started to meditate. I went to a Zen temple, which I was very grateful for. First I'd started just by reading and then talking about Buddhist philosophy and going back and forth with people about it. And after a short period of time, I found that that was not really improving my mental state all that much. So I thought, well, I better learn how to meditate. So I went to this temple, and they taught this very specific way of meditating. Kind of, you couldn't break the rules. We'd have retreats, and if you broke the rules, you'd get yelled at, and they would ask you questions. Are you doing the type of meditation that we taught, etc., etc. And it was very, very useful at the outset. Very, very helpful to have this very firm structure, this very firm framework within which I could work and not go outside of. So it's kind of a little bit stately. There's a war with the defilements. And at that time, the defilements that plague a person's mind when they first start to meditate are sometimes the most gross ones. They're ones of very gross bodily misconduct, one can have gross verbal misconduct, and kind of very, very bad habits that some have of distracting. So when one first comes to meditate, actually what one is trying to do often, if one is coming at it from a Western context, not a cultural context, one is a convert Buddhist in any cultural context, or one's a convert, then one is usually coming to Buddhism to try to eliminate suffering. So usually by that point, a person has developed these very negative habits that they know about that are causing them a lot of suffering, and they can't stop them. And sometimes they might also have these existential questions, why am I existing? What's the purpose that I'm doing all of this for? And all of these things can cause them quite a bit of suffering. So this kind of very formal way of meditating, this very formal structure where one basically knows exactly how one's going to meditate and one does not deviate from that, that can help to carve away at some of these very gross defilements. Oftentimes these very gross defilements, paradoxically, they're sometimes the easier ones to knock down. They have bosses behind them who are much more crafty. They're the ones who look really big, really strong, kind of drinking alcohol or, partying too much or using really coarse language. These very gross defilements or very, very bad distractions so that one is almost not functioning properly, is kind of battling with an addiction or so. These are the ones that look like these big muscular people in a war. And paradoxically, those are the ones, or what one wouldn't expect sometimes, those are the ones that are the easier ones to knock down. They sometimes only require this knowledge of meditation to the extent that one is just following this technique. Because what's happened over time is that one has chased sensual pleasures and one has been going out, sending one's mind outwards and consuming things outwards, and it's weakened one's mind. It's created habits in the mind, it's created openings in the mind because of this addiction that one eventually knows is quite bad. So when one learns to control one's mind just a little bit, just reining it in to a certain extent, only through this technique, okay, I'm just going to watch my breath, at the tip of my nose, I'll have my eyes half closed, I'll put my hands in a particular way, that's the only thing that I'm going to do. What this can do is help to train one's mind to stop it from its habitual tendency to just rush outwards. Just having this kind of structure is sometimes enough to give one the power that one needs in order to eliminate these gross defilements that one already knows about. So this is a little bit like this kind of stately warfare, this kind of warfare that's a little bit polite. There's rules to it. You meditate in precisely this way. You do things in precisely this way. This is exactly how you should meditate, and there shouldn't be deviation of that. As one goes along and keeps meditating, one eliminates some of these very gross aspects, these gross defilements in one's physical actions, in one's verbal behavior, in one's mental thoughts. Then what one finds sometimes is that there's actually enemies in this war that are superior, that are the bosses behind these really gross ones. They don't necessarily show up with big muscles, but they're much craftier, they're much quicker, and they have much more ability to cause harm. So these are the ones that often operate behind these. There's roots to these defilements, there's roots to the cravings that a person has, there's roots to the addictions that they have. And sometimes one has not developed sufficient levels of skill to give one's mind the satisfaction that it needs to let go of these more subtle roots. So this is an area in one's meditation practice where one essentially has to start to resort to more and more total warfare. It's kind of, what can I do to defeat this enemy? And it won't necessarily always just be something like a meditation technique. It could be the way or the amount that one is talking. It could be the way that one is looking, when one goes out and looks. And sometimes the way that one is doing things, they have these tipping points from skillful into unskillful. And these can even change from culture to culture. So monks, for example, are to train in being very gentle in their speech, very humble, very deferential. One of the things that I've noticed kind of coming to certain places is that actually people try to take advantage of that. And so what you notice from the very senior monks, the ones who are very skilled, is that there's a tipping point which they recognize, and suddenly their behavior, their verbal behavior, can become very ferocious and become very fierce. So it's a point where it tips from being this kind of very stately warfare, kind of with rules, to a point where one is actually watching one's enemy to see what moves they make, and the skills one develops have to become more and more refined. Sometimes one has to take on the tactics that the enemy takes on, kind of using more forceful methods. One has to take on tactics in the external world. Sometimes the defilements that come into one's mind are coming into one's mind because of the way that one is engaging in one's relationships. Sometimes one has to find completely new techniques because there's been some significant change in the status of one's health, or just the external resources that one has, which can change at any time. This is a kind of situation of total war. It's kind of whatever I can do to continue moving forward. Given these situations, I'm going to learn a way to do it. I'll try to find a way to do that. So very skilled warriors, very skilled generals, they know very different ways in which to undermine the enemy. There's, towards the end of the Buddha's life, there was a sutta in which a Brahmin approaches him at the request of King Ajatasattu, who had actually murdered his father, and says, I want to conquer the Vajis. And the Buddha basically gives a list of different qualities by which, if a person keeps them, they can only be expected to grow and not to decline, if a society keeps them. So the Vajis are keeping all 7 of these, so the Brahmin minister realizes, I can't defeat the Vajis through force of arms. I can only resort to trickery. It's only through basically sowing dissension among them that these Vajis can be defeated. So in a similar way, just forcing one's mind into a particular mold, going back to the technique over and over again, it's like force of arms in warfare. It's effective at a certain point. But when one faces a more wily general, one has overcome the infantry, then one has to learn to resort to this trickery, this kind of being wily oneself, and evaluating different ways, different means to shore up the mind that might tip into areas that one has never considered before, one has never tried before. But the victories in these battles are things that can give one a lot of confidence, because actually the Buddhist teachings point to a peace, they point to a happiness that does not depend on anything but our ability to gain victory over our own mind. So there's this verse in the Dhammapada where the Buddha says it's better to defeat better than defeating 1,000 men, basically, is to defeat just one person, and that's oneself. So when one goes into battle in this way, learning to think of the difficulties that one faces in one's mind as if they're living opponents, then one can realize at a certain point these opponents require different techniques. But the victories that one gains in this stage of battle, in this battle for victory over one's own mind, these are victories that are really worthwhile, despite whatever difficulties may come. These are victories that are really worth gaining, because the only peace that can come that's truly stable is peace over one's own mind. It's one of the reasons why the Buddha is called the Jina, he's called the victor. And he teaches anybody who follows him to be a victor for themselves, a victor over the defilements that cause them to suffer. Okay, so I think leave that for reflection, and wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.